neighbor, right? Cool. Should we get seats? Oh, yeah. The mic is on. It's perfect. All right, cool. Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you for waving back. No, thank you for all making the trek here. We know it's quite warm outside, so we appreciate you guys coming in here for this important event, as we think. If it's your first time here, maybe think about following us on social media or subscribing to our newsletter. And if you've been here before and you enjoy what we do and want to support independent journalism like we do, maybe become a member. You get cheaper tickets, access to our guest rooms and our club room, and loads more. So if you're interested, chat to any of the staff and we'll help you out. And now, without further ado, it's my honor to give over to the panel. And maybe a quick note, if you're too warm, feel free to grab some water on the back. It's free and you can have as much as you want. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Scotchbrook, and it is my great honour to be here at the Frontline Club, especially interviewing Gordon Carrera, who has brought out a fascinating book. Is there anyone here who's read the book already?
Oh.
Right. So this one young man has. So this is The Big Sell, and it's going to be very easy to sell because it really is a phenomenal book. But before we come to the book, The Spy in the Archive, that Gordon's written, let's learn a little bit about Gordon himself. Gordon, tell us how you got into journalism, when did it start, and talk us through your journey so we all know where you're coming from.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thank you all for being here, especially on a hot night, on a hot evening. It's very impressive. The concise version, the edited summary version, is that after studying history, I lived in America for a few years and joined the BBC a long time ago in 1997, which dates me, as a researcher on American politics. And that was my first role. And then joined the Today programme on Radio 4 as a foreign affairs kind of reporter and producer at the start of 2001. And then 9/11 happened. And, you know, for me, 9/11 kind of was a transformative moment journalistically, because suddenly covering America meant covering national security. It was the era of, Afghanistan, then in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, then terrorist attacks, Madrid, London. And so after doing that for a few years, shifted over to being a full-time security correspondent for the BBC, working alongside my good friend Frank Gardner, and did that for 20 years.
20 glorious years.
20 very fine and very interesting years doing it. But I have to say, 20 years doing the same job sounds strange, I think, especially now these days. But actually, the reason was it was a really interesting job, which changed every year, because every year you were looking at different national security threats. One year it would be very focused on, I don't know, Pakistan. The next year it'd be the Middle East. The next year it'd be nuclear proliferation. The next it'd be cyber attacks. Then it would be Russian espionage. Then it would be something, and it was like that. But then now I am mainly doing a podcast. Everyone has a podcast.
You officially left the BBC last year, but I've seen within the last week you're back at the BBC now as a security analyst, everyone, not a security correspondent, but an analyst. So
you can check out, but you can never leave. Yeah. That's the truth. So yeah, I'm back for the odd day. When they need me, the signal goes up, and I can do a bit of work for them, which is lovely, because I still have much affection for the BBC and for the work it does, and there are a lot of great journalists working for it. So it's great to still feel that occasionally I can contribute to that, but it's going to be very occasionally, I think.
But what they're doing is they're cashing in on your knowledge, and it is the lot of a specialist correspondent, be it in security or health or politics, that a lot of the work is done off the ball. That knowing your brief, getting to grips with your brief, finding the contacts. Talk us through some of that as a security correspondent. It's not just like ringing up a cabinet minister. Some of these contacts don't want you to be in touch.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is I think it's true for all specialist briefs, and I think it's easy to go, the security world, because it involves spies and that kind of world, is much more mysterious, and there's a bit of that. But I also think it's true if you're the health editor, or if you're a business correspondent, that it takes time to build up contacts and knowledge and trust and sources, And the longer you do it, the more you build up, and the easier it gets, which is another reason why I did it for so long. And I think that's probably a bit more true for security and intelligence than other areas. But as I said, I think it's true for lots of bits of journalism, that there's a value in spending time immersed in it, getting to know people, getting the kind of depth of knowledge which allows you to ask the right questions of people when you do get a chance, and when, we've had the Iranian nuclear program strikes, in the last couple of weeks. And again, if you'd lived through, which I had, Iraq WMD, you can remember some of the ways in which intelligence around weapons programs and military action is talked about, and it gives you a bit of a feel about what you really need to look out for. It's not the same situation by any means, but it gives you a bit of a feel for what you should be looking for and what questions to ask, I think, which comes from having done it for a while. I think that's definitely true.
When you're putting this book together, and using your vernacular, you got to know what to look out for. Did you find that there were people that didn't want you looking out for it?
That's often the way. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is it's not an authorized history, in which I've received any official help or assistance, and I'm kind of clear about that. You definitely, one of the things you have to do when you're researching these books or you're doing the journalism is you're trying to find the right people to talk to, and then you have to try and persuade them to talk to you. And it is absolutely true that some don't want to, or some will, but only in a partial way, and maybe trying to guide you in a particular direction. And that's the game, really, is to kind of be able to find the right people to speak to, persuade them, and not be led astray too far. But it's definitely true. There's some people I wanted to talk to, I couldn't. So I think you're always dealing with imperfect information. I think as a journalist, you're dealing with the information you've got and the sources you've got, and they can change, and they're based on people's memories, and they're based on people's agendas. I mean, that's true for journalism. It's true for kind of historical writing, like that kind of near contemporary historical writing. So you're always trying to kind of manage that process and be aware what agendas people might have, and how to kind of work around that, how to validate things, how to kind of triangulate the sources. And there are scenes in the book where I had multiple sources who'd been present at the same event and had different memories of it, which is a reminder. And I don't think it was necessarily because they were trying to spin me some line, but just people's memories, are different about the same event, even though they were there.
Where did you find the golden nuggets when it came to the research?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think if you look at the acknowledgements, I'm quite careful about my sources. Like any journalist, I'm going to be quite careful. The one thing I would say about this story, though, that was I think was very useful to me, was that it was not the elements of it were in the public domain, and I think that's slightly unusual with, and it's not always the case for spy stories. But the fact, it's about Vasili Mitrokhin, this KGB archivist, and the fact that he'd done what he did in broadest terms and fled to Britain in 1992, or got to Britain in 1992, was actually public. And there was also, it's part of the story which we might come to. There was a big hoo-ha around when that became public in 1999, and when the Mitrokhin archive, co-authored with Christopher Andrew, came out. And the hoo-ha led to an Intelligence and Security Oversight report by Parliament, by the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, which came out in 2000. And I found that report. It's one of those things you do, is you go back and look at 25-year-old ISC reports and read the appendix, because that's the trick. And it's a good trick in journalism, is always read, go really through it, because the appendix was extraordinary. Because I looked at it and I thought, hang on a sec, this has got a lot of information which would normally be considered classified. So it had, for instance, his code names that MI6 gave him, Jessant and Gunner. It had the timeline of his exfiltration by MI6, not the details, but the timeline. It had the details of the authorization, quoting from it, signed by the Foreign Secretary at the time to get him out of Russia. And I was like, this is interesting. And that, I have to say, the fact that very unusually had been made public, and I don't think if something similar happened today, I don't think it would be made public today. But that gave me a kind of anchor point for the research, because there was something in the public domain. And particularly if you're going to talk to people, you can say, it's been, the broad brush of this has been acknowledged and revealed. So it's a question of then filling in the details and the gaps, and particularly getting to the character and the personality at the heart of the story, which was really the challenge. But the kind of some of the bare bones were there, which I think helped.
Well, let's come to the character, or the hero of the story, if you like, in a moment, Vasili Mitrokhin. He is the subject of The Spy in the Archive, and I should say at this point that anyone wants to buy the book, there are plenty of copies at the back, and I know Gordon would be very happy to sign them and give a little message for you, whatever. But please make sure you get yourself a copy after we've had a little chat. Just a little bit from the beginning of the book, it says, how do you steal a library? Not just any library, but the most secret archive in the world. The answer is to be a librarian, to be so quiet that no one knows what you're up to as you toil undercover over decades, and so low-key that even after your escape, aided by MI6, no one even notices you are gone. That is Vasili Mitrokhin. We will come to him in a moment, but what we probably need to do is set the scene. And the scene is Russia, and it is the Russian society. I'm sure there are people here that know an awful lot more about Russian society and the way it has played out over decades. But at the heart of this, in particular, is the Cheka.
Yeah.
And will you talk us through the Cheka, how it was born, and how it developed over the years?
Yeah. So the Cheka is the security service of the Bolshevik regime, set up immediately after the revolution by Lenin, led by a man called Felix Dzerzhinsky. And it was more than just, if you like, the secret police. It was an extraordinary committee is the correct title, to counter sabotage and other activities which the Bolsheviks thought were trying to undermine the revolution. And it was given license to use pretty much the most extreme methods to preserve the Bolshevik revolution against the enemies, which we should say existed at that point in 1917. You've got white armies, you've got the Brits and the British Secret Service trying to, overthrow the Bolsheviks and kind of strangle this revolution at birth. And so the Cheka under Dzerzhinsky is, in the words of its founders, a revolutionary terrorist organization. That's what they actually call it. Terror is part of its inherent ideology, to liquidate enemies and use terror to preserve the revolution. What's so interesting about the Cheka is it's actually formally going to disappear. So it's going to be dissolved and come under a new name. It's going to go through a series of name changes, the Soviet secret police, the OGPU, the NKVD, the MGB, the KGB, today the FSB, and the SVR. But what's so interesting is Chekism survives. So the Cheka as an organization, as a name, dies. But today, people will call themselves Chekists. Vladimir Putin will call himself a Chekist. There is a Chekist day. And so there is this kind of continuity, which I think is very important, which starts at that revolutionary period, even goes back a bit before, actually, in some of the methods, and continues. And this ideology of Chekism, which, if you like, is an idea that you do whatever it takes, including using extreme methods, to protect the motherland. The revolution, the motherland of Russia, gets defined in different ways. But this is the ideology of a Chekist.
Well, there's a lovely line, which you say lovely line, it's a very telling line, I should say. Felix Dzerzhinsky, as you said, who was the first head of the Cheka, is quoted in your book as saying, "The Cheka must defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if its sword falls occasionally on the heads of the innocent." And I think that, to me, gave a real impression of how ruthless they were.
Yeah, they were ruthless. And it was, it wasn't a question of individual innocent or guilt for the Cheka. It was death by quota in some cases, and this would happen particularly under Stalin. That was the way of enforcing control, and it came from a kind of insecurity for the Bolsheviks and the revolutionary, and this kind of fear that there were all these enemies out to destroy them. But it is a persistent ideology, and I think that is an important part of Mitrokhin's story.
Well, you say that the estimates that the KGB arrested 20 million people in the 1930s. That's 20 million people arrested, of which 7 million were shot or died in prison.
Yeah, and this is the era of the gulags, the prison camps. This was the era of the Great Terror, enforced by the Chekists.
So this is the world that Vasili Mitrokhin grew
Yeah,
up in.
and he's born, and this is the interesting bit about him, is that he is a Chekist. He is a Chekist and a communist by background. He's born in the 1920s in rural Russia, to a kind of relatively poor rural family, and in a way the revolution, you can see why for him the communist, the Bolshevik revolution opens up a world of opportunity which might not have existed for someone from a poor background like him. And by the time he's a teenager, he's studying first at an archival institute in Moscow, so he's already got the interest in files, which is going to get evacuated during the war when the Second World War starts. And he is going to become, he is at this point a committed communist, and he is going to become a Chekist himself. He is going to get drawn into, the Soviet security services.
He becomes a KGB agent.
He does. He works first as a prosecutor in Ukraine at the end of the war, and it's a very interesting period about which he would never speak later in life. And when people asked him about it, he would just say, "I saw horrors," and the horrors were the reimposition of Stalinist control on Ukraine after the end of the war, when it had been fought over between the Nazis and the Soviet Union, and when the fear was from Stalin that there were nationalists who wanted to leave the Soviet Union, and the desire to crush those led to some extraordinary brutality. And Mitrokhin was a prosecutor, so he was a small cog in that wheel of reimposing Stalinist control in Ukraine. And I think my sense is that this was quite traumatic, and yet after that he's offered the chance to join what becomes the KGB, and he accepts. And I find it very interesting. He is, you can see why, if you're a young man at that period, the KGB is status, it's power, it's protection. He's not just going to be a KGB officer. He's going to be part of the first chief directorate, which is the elite foreign spies, the people who are going to go abroad to spy on the rest of the world. So it's a chance to see the world. This is something very attractive, and which, he grasps. So he is still, at this point, we're in the late 40s now, a committed communist and a Chekist.
But something goes wrong, because is there a specific moment where, like sliding doors, where he goes one way, could have gone the other, or was a build up of resentment, of unhappiness, of realization, if you like?
This was one of the hardest bits to research, because again, he would never talk about this later in life, what went wrong, but it does go wrong, and he has a very difficult. I think the one thing to say is I don't think he was a natural spy, in the sense of being a elite first chief directorate officer. I don't think he was a natural person who could do the cocktail circuit and sidle up to diplomats and chat to them. That was not his manner. He was a kind of quite introverted, quite intense person who was actually happier in the archives, and that was his mentality. So he didn't play the game very well, wasn't very good with the colleagues, all those kind of things. And then he goes on a couple of postings. He goes on one longer term foreign posting, which is to Israel, where he was undercover in a way, actually in the Orthodox Church, in a way he didn't like. And also at that point, while he's there, a group of agents within Israel working for the KGB are exposed. So things go wrong. How far he's to blame, but unclear. He then goes on a series of short-term foreign postings, including one which is extraordinary to Melbourne in Australia for the Olympics, for the 1956 Olympics, which is a kind of amazing story, because he is there as one of the KGB people to keep an eye on the Soviet team to make sure no one defects. But in fact, things go quite badly wrong again. It's in the book, the stories of there's basically a pitched battle in the water polo game between the Hungarians and the Soviet Union, because the Hungarian uprising has just happened, again, he gets the blame for
Well,
this.
he's egging them on, isn't he?
Yeah, he basically handles it very badly. And so immediately after that, he's back in Moscow, and on his file is stamped "not suitable for operational work." You know, I mean, that's it. You're done as a first chief director officer.
We've all had that.
We've yeah, my BBC file. Christmas tree. And he's anyway. So he's, and they think, well, what do you do with someone? He's not up to it. He's not very good spy. What are we going to do with him? He likes his files. Send him to the archives.
It could have gone another way altogether.
Yeah,
they might
could have
got
done.
rid of him altogether.
Yeah, I guess
they do.
even the KGB is probably smart enough to know it's not that good to sack people. Better to, banish them into literally the belly of the Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters, and make him an archivist. It can be, other people refer to him, those type of people as him, as clerical rats. People who would, the only reason you'd have any contact with them would be you'd pass them a slip of paper about what file you needed from the archive, and then they'd come and bring it out to you. So it's a dead end job, effectively. In some ways, he's a washed up failure at this point in 1956.
But you describe him as someone who would quite like that sort of job because he's a bit of a geek.
Yeah, no. So in a way, he loves the files.
Yeah.
So he's been, I think in many ways it is the worst personnel decision in history by KGB HR who decide to put this man in the archives. They probably think it's smart because, he likes his files and we've got to find somewhere for him. But the reality is for them, it's going to be a total disaster, unlike any that I think they've ever seen in their careers. Because
day to day, he has access to what?
Yeah, he has access to pretty much everything. And I mean, it's an interesting story because he'll rise up the ranks through the archive. So his initial job is quite a junior job in the file receipts section. And then he'll move up the ranks to eventually be a very senior archivist, and one of the most senior archivists. But I think the bit I found interesting was what happens then in those years, and it's a long, slow journey for Mitrokhin from committed Chekist and communist to finally a man who's going to defect and work with MI6. This is a journey which takes from 1956. The banishment to 1992, and it is not a snap, what immediate sudden move. It's something much more complicated in which the way I kind of understand it is that there's an interaction between what he's seeing happening in the world and in the Soviet Union, and particularly the failures of, reformist groups within communism. The kind of more liberal, if you like, communist ideas are getting stamped on at various points. And at the same time, he is seeing in the files the truth of what the Soviet Union and the KGB is doing. And it's this combination of those two things, the external events and his ability to see the truth in the files, which changes him over years. And I think it's not, it's a process which will take him years before he actually does anything. So again, looking at that timeline, 56, banished to the archives, he's not going to actually start doing anything really subversive until 1972. So there's this journey, and one of the key moments will be the Prague Spring, 1968, when again this idea of kind of socialism with a human face and more open communism is crushed by Soviet tanks. And he can see that happening, and that's the last hope of those who want a more open communism is going. And in the files, he's reading that the KGB is spying on those dissidents, planting weapons on dissidents, using the first chief directorate, these elite foreign spies, to spy on internal reform movements rather than on the West. And this is the reality he's understanding of what the KGB is doing.
What comes across, you talk about him developing this hatred for a monster, three-headed hydra, which is made up of the Communist Party, the nomenklatura, which is the elite of society, and the Chekist KGB. And what comes across is that he sees them, it's almost extolling this hatred for hatred's sake. They're not protecting anything now. It's just, they just want to keep everyone in line. And you mentioned how the KGB actually plotted to break Rudolf Nureyev's legs.
Yeah.
Because he had defected. That was the extent
Because
of it.
he's kind of astonished because he's seeing all the effort that the KGB is putting into, including spying on the abroad with its elite spies, is going after dissidents. Their first priority is dissidents. It's people like Rudolf Nureyev. It's chess players. They're sending teams of KGB agents to kind of track down Soviet dissident chess players because they can't bear the idea of them winning. And it's kind of there's a kind of, it says something about the Soviet Union to him. But what's so interesting is he becomes, he's he's both introverted and externally quite blank, but emotionally, I think, very intense. And he comes to hate the system with a spiritual fervor. And, you mentioned this monster. I mean, he really does start to see his enemy as a monster. I mean, he visualizes it as a monster from around 68, and he sees it as a hydra or a dragon with these three heads: the Communist Party, the nomenclature, and the KGB. And he starts to, see himself as if a hero in a Russian folk story, a kind of peasant hero, who is going to slay this beast. As someone engaged in a spiritual struggle against the beast. And it's, these references, they're there in his writings, but they're quite hidden. But if you find them, they're fascinating because they just give you an insight into the intensity of his hatred, for the organization for which he is working as the archivist. But it's entirely private and internal, this hatred.
So we've set the scene. We know a little bit about him as a man and the personal. Sorry, I'm going to say the journey he went on. I can only apologise for that. Sorry, but we can see how he has developed as a human being and how he's developed this hatred. There's still a long way to go, though, before he walks in through the British Embassy doors. So what does he start to do?
So he's developed this hatred from, I think, the late 60s, and the opportunity. You can have the grievance, but the opportunity to do something about it comes in 1972, when the KGB is moving office, or at least, to be specific, the first chief directorate, so the elite foreign spies of the KGB, are moving office. And they've been in the Lubyanka, downtown Moscow, long been the headquarters, and they're moving to a place called the Forest, Yasenevo, which is the woods out by the ring road, out of town. Kind of nice, spacey headquarters building for those elite foreign spies, away from the kind of grubby domestic spies. But the point is, if you're going to move, you need to move your files. So, and the job of an archivist, and by now quite a senior archivist, is to oversee the movement of files. So here is the opportunity, because he has an office, and the files are passing through him, all the files, and he has the ability to basically read them. And his official job is to work out which ones do we keep, which ones do we move, which ones can we destroy, classic kind of archivist processing, weeding job as you're about to move it. And he will, see this opportunity and seize it, and realize this gives him a chance to as I put it, to create a weapon to slay this beast that he sees. And so what he'll do is he will initially try and memorize what he's seeing in the files. He'll realize it's quite hard. So he will then instead note down on tiny bits of paper, using his own secret code, his own kind of shorthand, kind of almost like hieroglyphics, tiny notes about what he's seeing in the files he thinks is interesting. And then he'll take that bit of paper and he'll slip it into his shoe, fold it up, put it in the bottom of his shoe, and walk out Lubyanka. And of course, the clever thing about it is that he's not stealing a file. If you're stealing a big fat file, the guards at the Lubyanka are going to go, going to have a look at you. He's not stealing the files. He's copying tiny notes of the files of what he thinks is important, and then is able to go back to his apartment and on the weekends to his dacha and reconstitute the files. And one person described it to me as, like taking a dried stock cube and putting water on it, and then making
I'm going to stop you there because I'm going to ask you to do a bit of reading.
Okay.
Because this little chapter, or little section of the book, and it's not very long. It's, you can see on there where the pencil marks are.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It just describes.
I've got my glasses.
Do you want borrow my
No,
glasses?
I've got mine. Don't worry.
all these bits of paper that have been stored away in a milk churn, I think, underneath his dacha, and how he extracts the truth once again.
When his family were out or asleep, he would take out the slips of paper containing the tiny writing. He'd written his original note in a personal code, a shorthand to save space and time, in which individual letters or symbols substituted for common words. Now, in the way that a soup could be produced by boiling water onto a dried stock cube, he would reconstitute the original document and return the densely packed fragments into their original form. He would pull out the tiny notes he'd written in his special code and then sort them according to subject. He would rewrite the smaller fragments into larger notes, organised thematically by country, agent or operation. One of the things that was remarkable was his memory. Those who worked with him would describe it as photographic. Somehow he could take a word or two and use it to recall a whole paragraph or story. The next stage would be writing up notes in a kind of staccato-like prose rather than long wordy sentences. Astonishingly, what he would note down were not some vague recollections of a general story, but precise details, names, addresses, passport numbers, which would all prove highly accurate. Once a line or two from an original handwritten note had been transcribed, he would strike it through on the original with a pencil. If everything on a note was struck through, he would take the original to his hearth and burn it in the fire.
I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary image. And what's more extraordinary, at the moment, he doesn't know what he's going to do with this. He's doing it, I think, as you described, for the draw.
Yeah, and this is the other bit that I find really interesting, again, about his personality, is he's not a spy. You know, I mean, he is a spy in that he's working with the KGB, but he's not doing this at the request of MI6 or the CIA. He's had no contact with them. Certainly doesn't see himself as a spy. He actually doesn't know what he's going to do with this. And the way, you know, it's described is this quite Russian idea of writing for the draw. And it's this idea that you write because you feel the need to preserve the truth, even if you don't know when or how it will be published. And, you know, there is a tradition of this, and kind of Bulgakov did it with The Master and Margarita. Solzhenitsyn would do it with the Gulag Archipelago. They wrote and hid the writings. You know, they wrote for the drawer. They put it away in the drawer in the hope that one day it might be published, but not knowing whether it would be. And that was what he was doing. And it's kind of extraordinary thing in a way, this kind of compulsion to write, to record, to put down the truth, but not to know what you were going to do with it, you know, and not to have a plan about what to do with it. And he's doing this for years.
And all the while driven by, in the notes, he makes in the margins, he writes notes like filth on the trail of filth. I could not believe such evil. So he may not know what he's going to do with it, but he knows what's driving him.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things, is that most of the files, you know, he's writing up very coldly, but occasionally he would, just little bits of anger would come out, and you'd go, filth. He'd just write, you know, and he actually calls one of his files In the Footsteps of Filth, which I think gives you a slight insight into the man and his motivation. This idea that this was the kind of filth of what the KGB were doing, and that he saw it as this moral imperative to record it for perhaps future generations, because it's, in his mind, the truth was a weapon. You know, it was the weapon, the only weapon he had. So there he is, basically for 12 years, you know, writing up his notes and, you know, recording them.
And eventually he ends up with this weapon in the shape of all these notes.
Yeah.
1992 is when he makes first contact with the West. What state are the secret services, the Cold War? Where are we in the international picture at that stage?
So on Mitrokhin himself, he retires in 84, but he still keeps writing up the notes in his dacha. So he's still kind of compelled to write them up. And he's trying to think now, well, could I get them out? You know, how could I get them out? You know, is there a way of escaping over one of the borders? But by this time, of course, one of the problems is the notes are massive. You know, he's got files and files and files and files and files. You know, it's not a book. It's not, you know, 5 books. It's, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, it's, you know, probably fit across half this stage. It's not something you could carry out, you know, simply. So he's got a bit of a problem by his workload. And so he's a bit stuck. You know, he hasn't got a plan. And then something which no one expected happens, which is the Soviet Union starts to collapse. You know, 91, Soviet Union is collapsing. and he sees an opportunity, which is particularly he sees the opportunity in the Baltic states, which had been, of course, part of the Soviet Union, but had got their independence around 91, declared independence, and which meant Western embassies are now opening up in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and you can also still get them, and the border controls are quite weak going out of Russia. So he suddenly realized this is his opportunity, to basically approach Western embassies, and in his mind, it's the Americans, CIA, and offer them the files. And so he's going to go there and, to these newfound embassies and approach the CIA and thinking, I've got this amazing thing. And then they turn him down. I mean, and it goes to your question, which is what's going on at that point. I mean, lots of things are going on. One of the problems is it's very chaotic. Another problem is you've got lots of people trying to get out of the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, who are basically trying it on. And you've got a lot of people turning up at American embassies going, I used to be in the KGB, give me $1 million and a house in Florida, please, And some of them might have been a KGB border guard. Some of them might have been chancellors. So you've got a problem there. You've got a new policy at the CIA, which is to make nice with the Russians. Very interesting. Not to be seen spying on them because they're now our friends. We're going to kind of liaise with them and do work on counterterrorism and counterproliferation.
How significant was that? The fact that the Americans were taking their foot off the pedal bit?
Very significant. And, I spoke to quite a few people who were at the CIA at the time, some of whom are still angry about this. What are we now? More than 30 years on. They're still like, I can't believe, we were told to do that. So it's very interesting. The kind of, the divisiveness, but that's the policy from the top. And then finally, Mitrokhin himself has deliberately dressed down to approach the embassies because he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. So he's dressed like a tramp. I mean, he literally tries to dress down like a peasant, pulling a kind of grubby shopping bag, kind of on a wheeled shopping cart, which is underneath some sausages and clothes and bread, some files. But people, you can understand why people take a look at a man who's now 70, pitching up at an embassy, claiming to be KGB with a kind of shopping cart, and they're like, really? So he has some contact with the Americans, but ultimately they turn him away.
So the Americans turn him away, and there's a phrase that you used, which I think is lovely, that the Americans were doubtful the juice was worth the squeeze.
Yeah, that's how someone put it.
It wasn't worth the
They just didn't. And one of the things to say, and this goes back to the explanation of he wasn't stealing files. Remember, he was copying them. So even if he shows a file, well, it's not an original KGB file, is it? It's not got the stamps of the KGB. It's his notes of what the file said. So people are looking at them. If they do look at them, and they're like, how do we know if this is for real or not? Who knows? So,
well, I'm going to be a little bit careful. I don't want to give away the whole plot because a lot of this book reads, and this I hope is a flattering parallel. Have you ever read Ben McIntyre's books where some of the factual stuff reads like a novel, and there's a real pace and excitement to it? That is what this book is like too. And as I say, when the actuality starts to happen, and the cars start to fall and he starts to defect. But he does walk into the British embassy in Vilnius in Lithuania.
That's
Tell us a flavour of that.
Yeah, a flavour of that is, again, it's a kind of very newly open building, previously been run out of a hotel room, the embassy, just a few staff. He knocks up on the door, wants to speak to someone from the special services, which is how the Russians refer to kind of spies. There's no one there from MI6. Meets a young woman who is a diplomat, not a spy, but who speaks Russian and knows, and has very good instincts, and has a chat with him and offers him a cup of tea. And I think it's wonderful because it's this amazing unequal exchange because she offers him a cup of tea and he offers her the secrets of the KGB, the deepest secrets of the world, and that's the exchange which is done because, she kind of just senses he's a bit odd, but he's interesting. And she will then cable back through Berlin to MI6 to say someone interesting came out.
They don't snap his hand off.
No, and they say he's going to come back in April, first meeting in March, you might want to send someone out to meet him, which then starts the process in which, over the next few months, there's an initial meeting, there are more meetings, which, will lead to this kind of dramatic exfiltration.
Can you give us an idea of the sort of arrangements that would have to be put in place for someone who, I mean, you've given us an idea that there has to be a big decision as to whether this person is worth the investment, because presumably the family have to come, they have to be put up home. What sort of arrangements have to be put in place to keep this person safe?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When he meets the MI6 officer for the first time, he's like, here's what I want. I want not just myself, but all my family to come out. And I want you to publish my notes. Kind of unusual thing for someone who's a, spy to ask, but that's what he's asking for. Now, they can see and check the notes, and interesting how, but they can work out that these are real by cross-referencing it, for instance, what's in MI5 files. So they think, they realize they're onto something and it's good. It's going to cost though. And, one of the things is to agree to his demands. Another is the cost. And one of the funny things came across was the fact, the Treasury say no. Now, it may be familiar to anyone these days to think, hard up Treasury, but basically they go, Cold War's over. I'm going to pay for this, do you stump up loads of money to bring a whole family over, resettle them, house them, look after them for years and years and years, including, younger members of the family. The cost is roughly £1 million. That's not cash that's going to be given to him. He's not after the money, I should say. At no point is he saying, I'm going to, I want money. It's absolutely, ideologically driven and driven by his family and his situation. But that's the cost of resettlement. So the Treasury says no, so, the Brits go to the Americans, and they go, remember that guy you turned down? We think he's quite, he's quite good. If you fancy access to his stuff, do you want to give us some money? And so the FBI and the CIA basically go in for £1 million, and they're paying for the person they turned down, but in return we'll get access to the material. So it's interesting. It becomes, there's US, if you like, buy-in, because they can see this guy's good.
Did that realistically buy the Americans more access to surely would have shared the secrets anyway, or wouldn't we?
I think that's possible. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. And the American deal is that they will get kind of total access to all the files. I'm not sure they did straight away. I think there was a few bits where even they knew they didn't. That's the game. And, the reality of the special relationship in intelligence, even as close as it is, there's give and take, there's transactions, there's bargaining. It's not quite as some people would think. It's all, straightforward. So I think they got quite a lot for it, including access to him to be able to talk to him and deal with him.
That's what they share when they've got the family out. And again, we won't go into the minutiae of the detail, but it is worth saying that the rest of his family didn't know what was happening. They didn't know they were being taken out of the country. And while the USSR may have been collapsing slowly, the tentacles of the KGB were very far, and they stretched into Lithuania at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, the exfiltration story is a kind of wild story, which is kind of a big part of the book. I mean, it's kind of at moments blackly comic, and I think particularly because of this issue of family, because Mitrokhin wanted his wife Nina to come out, and she didn't know what he'd been doing all these years, which is also kind of interesting. To have done that for all those years, to being able to keep it from his wife.
It does raise just the image of him going out to his dacha and playing around with his milk churn, and no one asked what he's doing out there.
Well, people who've got a shed, go, I'm just going to spend the afternoon in the shed, dear.
Even Russia.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, it's hard to dissect people's marriages or relationships. I think we're not here for that. But I think, I mean, so it's worth saying, she was a very successful doctor. So she was an eminent ear, nose and throat specialist, kind of academic lecturing doctor. So, she's a busy, smart woman. He is an introverted archivist lost in his files. It's kind of interesting, people who knew them, it was an interesting dynamic, I think, between them. But here's the complexity. She gets told in 92 she won't go out, she won't leave without her mother, and they have a son. Vladimir. And the thing about Vladimir is he has a muscle wasting disease, which got picked up when he was young. He was born in 1953. And they've struggled to get it diagnosed and treated. And by the time if you get to 92, he's in a wheelchair. And so this is the kind of part of the drama of the exfiltration in the book, is that Nina, the wife, knows what's happening when they're leaving. The mother-in-law and the son do not know that they're being exfiltrated. You know, and I mean, you know, it leads to some kind of, as I said, blackly, strangely comic bits. You know, there's a bit where they're in a minibus, and the you know, the mother-in-law and the son think these are people from a clinic. They're going, you know, the cover story that is that they're going to a medical clinic for treatment, and the cover story is not just for border guards; it's for the two members of the family. And the mother-in-law is sitting next to one of the people linked to MI6 in the thing, and thinking, you know, who are all these people? These very strange, you know, people from the clinic, and there's a lot of them. And there's something kind of jutting into her, because they're packed into this tiny minibus. I mean, it's not even a minibus. It's like a kind of camper van style thing. And she's like, "What is that? Can you take it out of your pocket?" And he can't reveal it. It's actually a hand grenade that he's got in case things take a turn for the worse. You know, and she has no idea what's going on. And that leads, as I said, we won't give it all away, to a very dramatic scene at the docks where they're trying to get on a boat, and the son finally works out what's going on, and there's a confrontation there. And a very, very difficult moment, which nearly derails the whole thing.
Okay, so for the details of that, you will have to buy one of the books at the back here. They've come to Britain, and then they've got to share out the secrets.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, so he's arrived in 92, and this is, again, one of the wild things about the operation is it seems as if, and they plan it this way, that the KGB, or now the Russian security services, don't know he's gone. Now that sounds extraordinary, but they manage it because, of course, he's been retired for 8 years. And they've got two dachas and a kind of apartment in Moscow. They basically make it look like they're always somewhere else, and that the pension gets collected and the letters get collected, and people think they're somewhere else. And he's a solitary man. He has no real friends, or not many, it seems. And so you've got a period then from 92 to 99 where people don't know he's gone, and where, you know, it seems bizarre, but, you know, so here he is in Britain. You know, and he's got all his archives and he's working through them. MI5 are involved in the British files, and they're parceling them out to allies and to other countries to look at. And I mean, one of the, again, you know, interesting things I found was there's tons of material. I mean, this is a kind of, you know, these are details of KGB spies, yes, in Britain, yes, in America, yes, in France, but also in India, in Italy, in South Africa, in Kenya, you know, right round the world, details of the KGB operations. I mean, it's almost too much, I think, is one of the problems.
In the book, you say the CIA describe it as the biggest counterintelligence bonanza of the post-war period, in all 550 leads from that material. I mean, that is
just for the FBI, 550 leads, So it's thousands of intelligence reports. And I mean, some of it is a little bit awkward, because a good example is the French. Sorry, any French people?
Are there any French people?
Yeah, before or on the but one of the problems is there were tons of people in France recruited by the KGB. They've been very successful, particularly in the early Cold War period. So you had lots of people, for instance, in the French Foreign Ministry, who the files are revealing were KGB, including a very senior agent who was a cipher clerk and who'd led, you know, and who was still alive. So suddenly you're giving, you know, if you imagine you're British intelligence, you're giving this to the French, and you're saying, you know, good news for you, you've got a whole load of spies you never knew about before. I mean, that is actually, on the one hand, it's nice to know, but on the other hand, it's not very nice to know, because you've suddenly got a bit of a problem. It's a little bit embarrassing, and always a problem with when you get told you've got a spy. The question is, A, what are you going to do about it? And B, why didn't you catch them before, you know, to someone like the French security service? So, you know, it actually, what is a gold mine is also a bit of a headache for lots of countries, including, in some cases, Britain.
Well, one or two very high-profile British former spies were uncovered and became characters and almost celebrities in their own right in the Sunday Times and the like.
Yeah, I mean, and there were a few interesting characters. I mean, the most famous was Melita Norwood, who it turns out had been working on the British atomic program at the early Cold War and had given secrets to the Soviet Union. And again, it's this slightly embarrassing thing for MI5 because they'd investigated her and they'd had a look at her and they kind of cleared her and they hadn't realized how important she was, or that she was still active, or that she'd recruited other civil servants. So suddenly it's kind of like, this is actually a bit of a headache. And of course, this is happening in the 90s when people are thinking the Cold War's over, isn't it? Do we need to worry about Russian spies anymore? That's the kind of mentality at this point. So actually, this treasure trove is quite difficult in some ways.
Well, you could almost say he defected at the wrong time.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, if he had gone out in the 80s, could have been very, might have been very, very different. But that period in the 90s is very, it is, the intelligence and security services are looking for new adversaries to some extent. Their gaze is turning away from Russia to new issues. And so even the resourcing to look at this is quite limited at some points.
The way that the secrets came out, and there was the book, as you say, with Christopher Andrew. He was the main author, and then Mitrokhin became the sub-author or the co-author.
Yeah.
The way that was covered, the way it was published, that niggled.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing I guess I discovered when I was writing this, was just how difficult that process was. I mean, Mitrokhin, had demanded, he wanted his secrets to be published, his archive to be published. That had been one of his demands, as well as getting his family out. And the reason was, going back to his motivation, is this was his weapon. He wanted to wield this weapon and reveal what the KGB had been up to. And the primary audience in his mind was the Russian people. He wanted them to hear about what had happened. And then you have the tension where it's being published in the West in the late 90s. Publishers understandably want to sell books. It's not a bad thing to want to sell books. But and think, well, people are going to be interested in what it says about the Cambridge Five, not necessarily these other things. He's in this, he's put in touch with Christopher Andrew, who is the kind of eminent, British historian of the intelligence agencies, and who sees that in order to make this publishable, you're going to have to kind of explain the archive. But what Mitrokhin doesn't want that. He just wants the raw archive published, And so there's a falling out with MI6 and with Christopher Andrew, which, as I kind of talk about in the book, is quite bad at one point, because of Mitrokhin is so, he's so demanding, and so, has such a clear idea of what he wants that it's not easy. He was not an easy man to handle or to work with, I think, for those who did, which isn't to say he, and I think Christopher Andrews says it well in something he said, which is, try and get it right, not all difficult people are heroes, but a lot of heroes are difficult people. And Mitrokhin was a hero and a difficult person.
Well, there's another quote you said, that all defectors are defective.
Yeah. No, I mean, no one normal would do what he did. I mean, no one normal would spend 12 years risking your life copying down the secrets of the KGB, knowing it could kill you. I mean, that is not a normal thing to do. That is the work of a man who is driven. And so we shouldn't be surprised that then when he's in Britain, he is driven to kind of complete the task he set himself, and that leads him to conflict with those who have other ideas or who are trying to shape that in a different direction.
There's something very sad and almost pathetic about it, in that the media coverage is about the failings of our secret services rather than the hideousness of the KGB. And there's a lovely short passage here, which is it's him talking, it's Vasili talking after his wife had died. He's in Britain, and he says, "I don't think anyone realizes how much there is still to do. It's an absolutely Herculean task. It's a lot of work and worry and stress, and I've never taken time off. I haven't had a break for literally decades, and I'm looking forward to having a hard-earned day of rest when I can finally turn my back on all this evil to find some peace and quiet, perhaps even pray and think about my own soul." And it left me thinking, poor man, What did he believe his legacy was? What do other people believe his legacy was?
Well, and I think this brings me to the other bit of why I found his story so interesting, which is, his book comes out, the first volume, in 1999, and it comes out at a moment when people think the Cold War is definitely over. And yeah, there's this guy called Vladimir Putin who's just come to power. Yeah, he's an old KGB guy, but he's someone we can do business with. That's the attitude of politicians and others. And, the old has passed. Cold War is over. Now, Mitrokhin can see that that is not true. And that's what I find so interesting, particularly in his writings in the early 2000s, just before he dies. I mean, they are really powerful when you read them. And they're in quite obscure places. But what you find is he can see that the beast that he was fighting is not dead. And he can specifically see that the Chekists are still there. And he actually talks about the transformation of his enemy. And at first he thinks, we talked about the three heads, the nomenclature of the Communist Party and the Chekists. And he at first thinks, well, the Communist Party are gone, but now it's the nomenclature who've transformed themselves into the oligarchs and into the businessmen who are stealing resources, who are now in the lead, and they are using the Chekists. And then he starts to see in the 2000s, oh no, the Chekists are actually the ones who are back and who are becoming the dominant force. This kind of evil that he sees himself as having fought, he can see it's still there, just transformed. And you can, see it kind of, I think, quite painfully in his writings, that he is he's trying to sound the alarm. He's trying to warn people and say, the old has not passed. It is still here. It is still present. That Chekist ideology has been preserved even through the end of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union it served, and is still active and doing something. And he can see it in those Chekists. And, this is to me the kind of tragedy of Mitrokhin, in that he could see clearly in a way that I think almost no one else could see. And of course, the reason was he'd been one. He'd been a Chekist. He'd lived in the belly of the beast. He'd read the files. He'd studied it. He knew more about the KGB than anyone, I think, alive or dead, there's ever been, because he'd been the archivist for years. And he could see it was still there. But at that time, people outside couldn't see it. But now, 20 years, more than 20 years after his death, now we understand. I think now we can see the continuity. Now when you look at Vladimir Putin, you go, yes, he is a Chekist. Yes, you can see the kind of arc of what happened with the KGB through the 90s and the preservation of certain aspects of it in lots of different ways. You can see the extent to which certain techniques, and tools that were used in the past are still present today. All of that, would not have been a surprise to him. I don't think we could see it at the time and were listening to him.
So does that make his work more or less vulnerable, or the secrets he brought more or less vulnerable today?
I think I think it makes him, one of the most important spies of the Cold War, even though he only kind of didn't really become a spy or defect until after the Cold War, but because, of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, because he both individually told us about individual spies and KGB operations, which are in these great books with Christopher Andrew, 2 big volumes, which he co-authored, tons of detail, which reveal the truth. But it was also the fact of this warning that I think makes him such an interesting and important figure, that I don't think, he'd been appreciated, in a way he should have been. And, that's in a sense what drove me to tell the story, because, it's about a man and his amazing journey. And yes, it's about the specific secrets he took out, but it tells us something about Chekists, spies, and the danger, which spans 100 years, from the 1920s through to the 2020s. And that, I think, is an important story for our world today.
Well, I Couldn't agree more. Gordon, thank you very much indeed. That's my go at asking questions. Before I even said questions, I can see 2 hands up already. We have got plenty of time to ask questions. So
it's hot, so don't want
but, so
You
have
need
a
a
good
drink.
think. I hope Gordon's inspired you. Certainly inspired me by reading the book. And I'm going to ask this gentleman here, just behind. We will come to everyone, I promise. But you had your hand up first, so I'm going to step off and give you this microphone so we can all hear what you're saying. Actually, bear with me while on my old knees. There we
luck,
go.
Ben.
Right.
Yes. We should say this will be off the live stream. Thank you for everyone who's been listening on the live stream. But we'll
Give Gordon a bit of freedom to answer.
yeah, a bit easier. But anyway, thank you for joining us. For those who have been.